welcome to the Reading Nook. So here in this little segment on my channel is the Reading Nook, where we are reading A Cat's Chance in Hell by Sharon Hannaford at this moment in time. So make sure you've got your drinks and you're good to go. Without choking on your drinks, of course. So I'm going to pop up some pictures of the canvases that we've worked on so far, and all details of current projects are in the comment section below. Big shout out to Sharon Hannaford. Thank you so much for giving me your permission to read this on my channel. It's been great fun, especially the accents. I'm so sorry. As you saw at the start as well, there's a warning. It's for mature audiences, so please, no kids. But other than that, I hope you enjoy. Bye!
Chapter 24. Julius sped towards the door, his boot-covered feet barely touching the ground. He could feel Dante's and Gabby's presence in the room beyond the door. He wasn't sure how many non-vampires were in the room with them, but it didn't matter. He didn't bother to check if the door was locked or not. He simply threw his power and his weight at it, and it shattered into confetti wooden splinters. He plunged into the room, prepared for anything, except the scene that faced him. It took him half a second to scan the entire room and realise that there was no one else in the large, dank room, except the two people on the floor near the far wall. A lighter and candles lay on a table amid a collection of knives, wooden stakes, and pieces of silver chain. There was blood on most of the knives, and it wasn't Dante's. Julius forced himself to drag his gaze from the contents of the table to the target of his rage, the vampire now hunched over the much too still form of the woman he would do anything to protect. He knew before a second had fully passed that what Dante was doing, crouched over Gabby's motionless body. He was doing the one thing that would hurt Julius the most. He was taking Gabby's blood, draining her so that he could turn her, change her into a vampire. Dante's vampire. If Dante managed to get enough of his own blood into her at the right moment, Gabby would become a vampire and would inescapably be tied to Dante. By vampire law, she would be his to do with as he pleased. Julius saw the same thoughts fly across Dante's face as he swept across the room towards him. Dante had counted on having more time, but he would try it now if he was forced to. His mouth ripped from Gabby's neck to his own wrist. "No!" roared Julius, flying at Dante. His rage afforded him speed and strength he'd never experienced before. Before Dante could withdraw his fangs from his own vein, Julius was on him. Julius didn't even bother trying to hold the deranged vampire with his power. It was too much of a risk with Gabby lying so close, and Dante's blood already welling from the puncture wounds in his arm. He simply launched himself at Dante with the power of a speeding train. The other vampire flew backward through the air to hit the bare brick wall several feet away. The force of his impact cracked the wall and shook the room, bringing up a cloud of dust and debris raining down on them all. Dante leapt up from the floor, flicking his long dark blonde hair out of his eyes and dusting off his clothes. For a moment the two vampires simply stared at each other, their memories peeling back the years. "Julius?" Dante's voice was calm and gentle, but still held the usual tinge of arrogance. "It's been too long." As Julius stalked towards the vampire, placing himself between Dante and Gabby's still form, he found himself looking into the face of someone he had once loved unconditionally, someone he'd respected and adored. "Yes, it has, Danny," Julius said, only barely conscious of using the old nickname. The other vampire let out a peal of maniacal laughter. "Sorry, Julius. In case you haven't noticed, Danny doesn't live here anymore. There is only Dante, demon master and soon-to-be master of this city," Dante declared, wiping a smear of blood at the corner of his mouth and sneaking a hungry look at Gabby around Julius's shoulder. "You're not going anywhere near her again," Julius said in a low warning. "This is going to end here and now." His words didn't seem to register with Dante, and he continued as though Julius hadn't even spoken. "I must say, I can see why you've kept her around. She tastes awfully good, even if she's a bit too spirited for my liking. I think I've solved that problem, though." His voice dropped into a spiritual whisper. "Pity you won't get to enjoy the new broken-in Angeli Morte." Julius's chest tightened and rage washed through him in a cold wave. "But there's only room for one of us in this world." Dante's voice trailed off as his eyes suddenly turned devious, and he took a step closer towards Julius. "Unless, brother mine, you are willing to join with me." A new plan seemed to be blossoming in his mind. "Come, Julius, give me your blood oath. Stand beside me instead of against me. Demon Master and Vampire Master will be unstoppable. Even the precious Princeps will be running for cover. The world will be ours to do with as we please. His eyes were alight with excitement and fervour. As Julius stared into Dante's demented grey eyes, he knew he was finally doing the right thing, and it gave him a small measure of peace. Dante had given him an opening, and he took it. His eyes softened, his body relaxed, and his eyes closed in apparent submission. "Brother," he whispered, almost stumbling towards the other vampire, reaching out his arm as though to welcome him. Dante froze for an instant, his expression suspicious, but then he smiled. He moved towards Julius, reaching out to him in welcome. Julius moved willingly into the embrace. "Danny," Julius whispered again, "I love you." And then he plunged next into Dante's back, straight into his brother's heart, twisting the blade viciously to make the death quick and final. He watched the shock flash across Dante's face as he held his brother's body against his own for a moment. Then the shock left Dante's face, and in that last moment of life, his brother's human eyes stared into his, and they looked grateful. Then the light was gone. Julius took a deep breath. "Goodbye, Danny," he said, still whispering, and he let his brother's body drop to the floor. He didn't watch as the body began to wither and shrivel, but rushed back to where Gabby lay utterly still on the floor, in a spreading pool of her own blood. He desperately moved her head to get a better look at the bite wound across her neck. Blood was still pulsing out of the open carotid artery. A movement in the doorway brought Julius back to his feet in swift movement, immediately on the defensive. Carl and Alexander surged into the room and stopped dead at the sight in front of them. Carl had switched back to human form and was wearing Alexander's overcoat. "Dante?" Alexander asked urgently, eyes darting around the room. Julius indicated with a toss of his head the pile of decaying skin and bones lying a few feet away. "Gabby!" Carl cried, horrified as he took in the sight of her. Besides the blood pooling around her shoulders, she had obviously been beaten, stabbed, cut and burned. One side of her face was a black and red swollen mess, her eye swollen shut, blood trickling from her mouth and nose. Julius looked down at her and then at the blood covering his hands, her blood, and her blood lying crumpled in a heap at his feet. His head swam as he realised that this was his vision come to life. This was what he had seen would happen so many days. Was it only days? It felt like months before. "No, no, 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 no!" His voice rose with each denial until the last was a kind of roaring keen. "Stop that!" Carl yelled at him. "She's still alive. Can't you feel her heartbeat? Listen, Julius. She's still got a chance. We must stop the bleeding." "Julius!" Alexander's voice cut into his moment of insanity, sharp and reproachful. "Carl's right. She's still alive. Either help us or get out of the way." Julius felt a semblance of sanity return, felt the red tinge to his sight fade a little, and realised he was crouched over her in a protective stance, daring anyone to try and get near her. He blinked and mentally shook himself, trying to calm his inner sense of hopelessness. "Get the medics, now!" he growled at Kyle. Then he knelt in the blood close to her head. He leaned down to brush away her blood-matted hair and fastened his mouth to the terrible wound. He sensed more than saw Alexander keep Kyle back when Kyle saw what he was doing, reassuring him that Julius was only stopping the blood flow, not feeding. He heard Kyle speak quickly and urgently into the phone, telling the medics where to find them. He kept the pressure on the wound with his tongue, not even tasting her blood in his mouth as he did. He worked his mouth, making himself produce more saliva, forcing it into the rip of the artery with his tongue. Once he felt the pulsing slow, and could sense the wound coming together, starting to close, he unfastened his mouth from the area. He continued to look over the wound again and again, cleaning the blood away from her torn skin and flesh, and beginning to seal the outer wound. He prayed to whatever God was listening that he'd done enough to stop the flow of blood from the artery. Carl let out a relieved breath when Julius moved away from her neck and they could see the blood flow had stopped. Carl knelt down on the other side of Gabby and was now trying to assess her injuries and do something to help. "I'm not sure the artery is completely sealed," Julius said, lisping slightly as he tried to speak around his extended fangs. "We need to get her to hospital. Her heartbeat isn't strong and steady. She's lost far too much blood." "The medics are at least a few minutes away. They'll have to be escorted through the fighting." Carl said. "Ian is on his way to the chopper. He has bagged blood with him, but his ETA is about 10 minutes. It was a clear indication that all of them were monitoring her condition closely when all three of them looked at her simultaneously as her heartbeat faltered for a terrifying second, and then started up again in an unsteady hiccuping rhythm. Julius, Carl said anxiously. You gave her blood to heal her when she was staked. Give her some now. Enough to stabilise her until the medics can get here. Julius turned tortured eyes to Alexander's, briefly acknowledging Alexander's brief shake of his head before looking back at Carl. I wish I could, Julius whispered hoarsely. But it's too dangerous. What? Shouted Carl in disbelief. You're the reason she's lying here. Now you can't do anything to help her? His anger, quick and hot, burst across the vampire's senses. The smell of wolf suddenly filling the room. Neither of them had seen Carl lose his temper, never even seen him come close. Carl, Alexander said, putting a calming hand on his shoulder. You need to understand what happened before we got here. Julius didn't say he didn't want to help. He said it's too dangerous. What's that supposed to mean? What happened before we got here? Carl was still furious. If he was any other werewolf, he would have already been spouting fur and fangs and 4 legs. Dante was trying to turn Gabby, Alexander explained calmly, but Julius could hear the edge of fury in his voice. That's why she was on her way to bleeding out. He wasn't just feeding, he'd opened up her arteries so he could drain her. He was in the process of turning her into a vampire who would have belonged to him in every sense of the word. Carl shuddered, but persisted in his angry frustration. So why does that make it dangerous for Julius to help her? To finish turning a human, a vampire has to give his own blood to the human after he's almost drained the human of their own blood. Do you understand now? Julius demanded, angry again at himself. She's lost enough blood that if I give her any of mine or Alexander's, it may finish what Dante started. It may turn her into a vampire. Do you think she really wants that? Do we have the right to make that decision for her? Julius could no longer contain the profound turmoil inside him. Pain seared across his face. His eyes burned with fear and torment. Shit. Carl slumped down beside her, taking her hand, bringing it up to his mouth to brush the back of it against his lips, closing his eyes as though in prayer. There were brutal black and blue marks circling her delicate-looking wrists, interspersed with bleeding, chafed marks, and a blade-shaped burn stood in sharp contrast to the rest of her perfect ivory pale skin, along the length of the inside of her forearm. Julius purposely avoided taking an inventory of all of her injuries, concerned he might lose his tenuous grip on the sanity if he saw all the evidence of the brutal abuse she'd been subjected to. Alexander moved to a position near the door on full alert as sounds of fighting drifted down to them. Hang in there, babe. Come on, Hellcat. You gotta hold on until help gets here, Carl murmured to her, almost crooning. One emerald green eye, the unswollen one, floated open and tried to fix on his face. Gabby? Gabby? Carl shouted excitedly. Can you hear me? He leant over her anxiously. She didn't respond, just kept her eye trained unsteadily on Carl. Gabrielle? Julius tried now, gently running the back of his fingers down the less injured side of her face. It's all right. You're safe. Medics are on the way. Her only response was to move her eye from Carl's face to Julius. Julius? Alexander interrupted, moving closer to them again. Something isn't right. If she's conscious, she should be reacting to pain of her injuries. She's too still. Can you taste something strange in the air around her? Shit, Julius cursed. You're right, Alexander. I could taste magic. How did I miss this before? Someone has bespelled her. It must have been the Dark Magus. What has that bitch done to her? We need Athena, Carl spoke urgently. Her speciality is counterspells. If anyone can release Gabby, she can. Alex moved in a rush of wind and was out the door before Carl finished his sentence. The other 2 men both turned their attention back to Gabby as her breathing faltered and her heartbeat became stuttered staccato. Gabby, Carl said sharply as her eye began to drift shut. Stay with us, sweetheart. We need you to stay here. Stay with us. Someone has to help us nurse that vicious cat of yours back to health. Julius might have saved him, but that doesn't mean he'll be allowed anywhere near him again. He was grasping at straws, trying to find reasons to make her fight stay with them, but incredibly it seemed to help. She opened her eye again. They both saw the pain in her wavering gaze, and they both knew she didn't believe Carl that Razor was still alive. She obviously thought her captors had killed him. It's true, Gabs, Carl insisted. We got to your house minutes after the fight had gone down. Razor was still alive, if only barely. I don't think a vet could have saved him, but Julius gave him some of his blood. You wouldn't have believed it if you didn't see it for yourself. That bloody cat got up and started trying to track the bastards who took you. We had to restrain him and lock him in one of your steel cages out in the garage to keep him from coming with us. Carl was babbling now, but it seemed to be holding Gabby's attention. The emotional pain in her gaze had eased. Alexander arrived back in a whoosh of air, unceremoniously depositing Athena down in the room and pushing her towards Gabby and the other two men. "What?" Athena said in confusion, trying to regain her balance and get over a shock of being swept up by the stunningly handsome English vampire and rushed through to this dungeon of a room at the speed of lightning. She was thankful she'd borrowed a pair of jeans and a sturdy pair of boots for this mission instead of wearing her usual attire. Then she saw what Carl and the arrogant master vampire were hovering over, and her breath caught in horror. Gabby? Could that body lying slashed, burned, bruised and broken in a pool of blood possibly be Gabby? The way the men were stroking her face and hands, talking encouragingly to her, it had to be her. Tina couldn't believe that she was still alive. Alex suddenly gave a frustrated sigh and grabbed her hand and dragged her closer to the group on the blood-splattered floor. "We think there's a spell on her. She is an action, right? And we can smell magic on her. Do something," Alexander ordered her in a tense snarl. "Try to wipe the horror off your face. We need to try and keep her calm," he growled to the last warningly. Athena took a few quick, gasping breaths, trying to master the expression on her face. She thought the battle outside was horrific, watching the violence and destruction, but seeing someone she knew lying in that state wasn't something she was prepared for. She may not particularly like Gabby, but she now had a far greater understanding of the strength and tenacity of the other woman, and what hunters went through in the line of duty. Managing to gather herself, she walked around Carl and knelt at Gabby's head, the knees of her borrowed jeans quickly soaking up the congealing blood. "I need the two of you to back away a bit," she said to Carl and Julius. Both men turned defiant glares at her. "Please," she tried again. "I can't get a clear idea of the spell with you touching her." Carl gently put Gabby's hand down and moved back a foot or so. Alexander had to come over and put a hand on Julius' shoulder before he did the same. Athena closed her eyes and moved her hand slowly back and forth over Gabby's head and shoulders. "It's a spell of compliance," she said without opening her eyes. Well, a twisted version of the spell of compliance. Designed to paralyze her. Athena gave a horrified little shudder and opened her eyes. "I can remove it, but once I lift it, she'll probably flail around in pain. You'll need to be ready to hold her steady, but do not touch her until I say so." She looked at Carl and Julius with her own warning glare. "Do you understand me? This is going to be a difficult spell to lift, and if you interfere, you could do her permanent damage." "Yes, we understand," Julius answered angrily. "Just get on with it." Athena took a few deep breaths, centering herself and calling on the Lord and Lady to assist her. Then she laid her left hand on Gabby's forehead, her right laid flat over her own heart. As she opened her mind in search of Gabby's essence, a wall of physical pain crashed into her with enough force to knock her sideways into the blood-stained floor. She caught herself painfully on her left elbow, gasping for breath, a sweat instantly breaking on her forehead. "What's wrong?" all three men demanded simultaneously. Julius lunged for Gabby again, catching himself a millimetre before touching her. Strain and worry etched into his face. Carl's hands clenched into tight fists and he was breathing hard like he was fighting to keep himself calm. "Her pain," gasped Athena. "When I merged with her mind, I can feel her physical pain. Lord and Lady, how can she stand it?" She pushed herself back into position and got ready to start again. She hoped she was prepared for the onslaught this time. Alexander moved closer to her and took up position just behind her. Athena wondered if he was there to stop her from making a break for it. "She's in a world of pain. Once she can move, she'll probably react to it quite strongly. Be ready." The men all nodded. "Is it all right for me to catch you if you collapse again?" Alexander asked. She nodded quickly, barely thinking about how an hour ago she would have cringed at the thought of his cold touch. "Yes, just don't touch Gabby until the spell is lifted." She laid her hand back on Gabby's forehead and plunged back into a world of fire and agony. She knew Gabby could feel her presence. She felt Gabby relinquish what was left of her battered mental defences and allow Athena free rein over her essence to begin unravelling the complicated spell. A small commotion at the door captured her attention for a second, but as soon as she realised it was the Magus medical team, her focus was back on Gabby. She ignored the gasps of horror and hushed whispers and concentrated on unravelling the complex, twisted spell. She barely noticed Alexander motion the newcomers to stand still and not approach. Her breathing was coming in short, sharp gasps, and she could feel the sweat beading on her face and neck as she continued her silent chant. As the spell began to break down, the air was suddenly thick with a feel of the dark energy rising around them. Sickly sweet odour intertwined with the fetid stench of the long dead, lifted the hairs on her arms and sent shivers down her spine. Obviously, she wasn't the only one feeling the effects as the Magi medics quickly began a low murmured chant, and soon a crisp, clean breeze swirled around them, fending off the vile touch of the dark magic. Finally, she felt the last thread of the spell snap, and her chant broke off. "Now," she whispered hoarsely, and she slumped sideways as though boneless. Alexander caught her limp body and carried her over to the medics. Carl and Julius both leapt into action as Gabby gave a low, agonised scream and tried to curl into a protective fetal ball. Each of them tried to hold her shoulders and hips gently in place, crooning to her as she brought the hoarse screams under control. "Watch out for her ribs and her right leg," Athena warned them urgently. She was in a sitting position but still panting as though she had run miles and was feeling distinctly lightheaded. "I think she has a cracked skull and broken jaw on the left too." The two female magi near the door now rushed forward. "Let us help," Melinda said. "We can ease some of her pain and try to repair some of the damage." Athena knew that while Melinda looked barely out of high school, she was an accomplished healer who'd been involved with the SMV for many years already. If anyone could help Gabby right now, it was her. Carl moved away from Gabby a little to allow the medic access to Gabby's side. "Be careful, Melinda. I can see you're exhausted already. Don't overdo it. Just the life-threatening stuff," he said firmly. Athena felt an unexpected fusion of respect for the semi-werewolf and, for the first time, a twinge of guilt that perhaps she'd been treating the non-magi a little unfairly. Melinda was already running her hands over Gabby's body about an inch over her flesh. Tyron, another dark-haired and slightly older magus, knelt down near Gabby's head, trying to avoid the blood. Julius flashed a dark, antagonistic glare at her. She cringed back slightly but didn't move away. Julius could feel Athena's annoyance as he glared at the healer, crowding him away from Gabby. "I can heal the burns so they won't scar," she said in a tiny squeak of a voice before Athena could interrupt and berate him. Julius's glare softened and he sighed. "Sorry," he muttered, backing down and feeling the other magi relax. "Do anything you can to ease her pain." Then he turned his attention back to Gabby, ignoring the gathering crowd. "Go ahead, Tyron," Carl encouraged gently. "Just don't exhaust yourself. There are others injured outside who'll need your attention." She nodded and set to work, centering herself. "She has a slight tear in one lung from a splintered rib," Melinda said, "and there is some other internal damage. I'll try and repair as much as I can." She settled herself closer to Gabby's body and placed both hands on top of one another over Gabby's right lung and began chanting. As the chanting grew between the two women working over Gabby, the others at the doorway started to chant too. Soon the air was filled with a warm, radiant energy that seemed to caress the skin and to soothe and to calm troubled thoughts. Suddenly, Gabby took a deeper, easier breath and seemed to sigh in relief. Her body relaxed a little under Julius's touch, and he didn't need to fight so hard to try and keep her still. He could see full consciousness return to her as her gaze caught his. She really looked at him for the first time since he'd entered the room. "Leah, I'm so sorry," he whispered to her. "I can't tell you how sorry I am that he did this to you. I can't tell you how sorry I am that I wasn't able to protect you from him." His eyes filled with all the pain and torment he was feeling. She weakly lifted her fingers to his mouth and laid them over his lips, wincing as something hurt her. "Shh," she hissed through gritted teeth, obviously unable to move her jaw. "I'm okay." He gently pressed her fingers close to his lips and kissed them, closing his eyes against the grateful tears that threatened to spill down his face. "Raz?" Julia smiled weakly. "Yes, he's going to be fine. Probably more dangerous than ever for a few weeks until the vampire blood wears off." "You hope the effects wear off," teased Alexander from somewhere near the door. He and another magus were hovering over Athena, trying to get her to sit down in a chair and drink something. She wasn't playing good patient and looked ready to collapse any minute. "Dante?" Gabby drew his attention back to him. "He's gone. Dead," Julia said in a toneless voice. "I destroyed him. He will never touch you again." He could hear the steely protectiveness in his own voice. Gabby closed her eyes, looking grey and exhausted. A phone rang somewhere in the room. Carl reached into his pockets. "Ian is here. I'm going to lead him in," he said quickly and rushed out the door. "Stay with us, Leah," Julia said sternly to Gabby when it looked like she may slip back into unconsciousness. "Ian is almost here with blood and pain meds for you. It's going to be all right. Just try and stay with us." The two magi had been working on her slowed their chanting and took deep, steadying breaths as they moved away from her. They both looked pale and tired. "We've done what we can," Melinda said. "She needs blood and fluids now more than anything." "Thank you," Julius said gratefully. "I can feel how you've eased her pain. I'm in your debt." As the Magi medics melted away, taking a still trembling Athena with them, Ian, Carl, and a human medical team burst into the room. Ian rushed straight to Gabby and Julius, shouting orders at the two human men who were setting down a stretcher and other medical supplies nearby. Ian gave Julius a cursory nod of greeting and set to work fastening a pressure cuff around Gabby's upper arm, trying to avoid a partially healed burn and a heart rate monitor to one of her fingers. He was keeping his expression carefully neutral and businesslike, but Julius could taste the doctor's anxiety and horror at seeing Gabby in this condition. He calmly asked Gabby a few questions, but when Julius could hear how hard it was for her to speak, he broke in and told Ian what Athena and the other Magi had said about her injuries. Ian listened carefully to the list of her worst injuries as he deftly set up 2 IVs, one with blood and one with saline, and Carl acting as an IV stand. Ian tried to find a vein in her hand and then in her arm, growling in frustration as the needle didn't find what he was looking for. The heart monitor bleeped erratically, warning them that her heart was beginning to fail, and the lack of blood was taking its toll with each passing second. Julius suddenly put out his hand. "Let me try." Ian hesitated for a second and then handed the needle to Julius. Julius took the needle and lifted Gabby's arm in his large, pale hand, closed his eyes and ran his thumb softly over the creases on her inside of her elbow. Once, twice, a third time. Then, in a blur of motion, he sank the needle home and was rewarded almost immediately with a drop of blood from the other end of the needle. Ian let out a breath he probably didn't know he'd been holding and quickly injected a full syringe of morphine into Gabby before hooking up the blood and saline. As the morphine and blood slowly helped steady Gabby's heart rate, and her blood pressure began to normalise, the rest of the world came back into focus for Julius. He realised he had no idea what was happening above ground. Carl had reported that the worst of the fighting seemed to be over. Since Dante's death, many of his followers, the vampire ones anyhow, had surrendered and were throwing themselves on Julius's mercy. Julius was only interested in finding Mariska and making sure they'd eliminated all the demons. He gave Alexandra a look, and his second-in-command left on quick, silent feet to check on what was going on. The other 2 medics helped Ian splint her broken ankle, while Carl and Julius helped keep her still. Julius closed his eyes and breathed deeply when she screamed in pain, reminding himself to keep his grip on her gentle. At that moment in time, he could have destroyed Dante 100 times over without feeling a single moment of regret. Finally, Ian allowed Julius and Carl to lift her onto the stretcher. As they were prepared to leave, Julius stooped down and picked something up and put it on the stretcher with Gabby, tucking it in against her thigh, in reach of her right hand. She noticed the movement and moved her hand down to touch the object. An almost contented smile lifted one side of her mouth as she closed her fingers around the familiar shape of Nexie's hilt. Then they left the horror of the underground cellar and headed for the helicopter as fast as they could without jostling her. Join me next week for the final chapter. Thanks everyone. Bye!